In Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, he shares a short story that was written in 1961. The story depicts a dystopian future America where, by constitutional amendment, nobody is allowed to be smarter, better looking, or more physically able than anyone else. The handicapper general, as the story shares, is the government officer tasked with enforcing equality of abilities and outcomes. Anyone with a high IQ is required to wear an earpiece at all times that buzzes loudly every 20 seconds or so, with a variety of noises designed to interrupt sustained thinking, thereby bringing the person down to the functional intelligence of the average citizen. As Haidt reflects, he says, I thought about this story as I began to talk with my students a few years ago about how their phones were affecting their productivity. He says, when you add it all up, the average number of notifications on young people's phones for the top social and communication apps amounts to 192 alerts per day, according to one study. The average teen, who now gets only 7 hours of sleep per night, therefore gets about 11 notifications per waking hour, or 1 every 5 minutes. And that's just for the apps that are about communication. When we add in the dozens of other apps for which they have not turned off push notifications, the number of interruptions grows far higher. And we're still only talking about the average teen. If we zoom in on heavy users, such as older teen girls who use texting and social media apps far more often than any other group, we are now in the ballpark of 1 interruption every minute. Thanks to the tech industry and its voracious competition for the limited resource of adolescent attention, many members of Gen Z are now living in this dystopia that was depicted in 1961. This is episode 10 of Digital Christianity, a generation unable to hear the preached word. In last week's episode, you heard from Patrick Miller. He's a pastor, author, podcaster who does a great deal of writing, thinking, speaking about the Christian's engagement with technology. He said something last week that I wanted to highlight.
And there's, again, tons of research to show this, and people might not care, like, oh, well, why does it matter if my attention span dropped from 45 seconds to 9 seconds? Well, why it matters is because God gave us minds, and our minds are designed to be able to think logical thoughts, to be able to reason things out, to be able to have discourse on subjects, to learn from one another. If your only way of intaking information is image-based, you will become a highly subjective, highly influenceable person. You won't know how to use your brain. If we don't read anymore and we don't know how to have long-form discourse to be nuanced in our thoughts, we're going to be people who are unnuanced, who have uncareful takes on important issues. And so, again, this applies to teens, it applies to adults. There's so much research that shows that these devices are having a detrimental effect on our life on the whole.
When I've spoken with students throughout the years, and even my own children as they struggle over hating school and why do we have to go to school, some of my counsel has been this: God gave us brains, and they don't belong to us, they belong to Him. We are to steward those brains, and school helps us to do that. As Patrick said, the image-based childhood that marks many preteens and teens' lives could raise a generation who's unable to think well about anything. This is concerning on many levels, but it's definitely alarming when you think about this reality in relation to God's Word. Now, it's challenging to jump into any portion of the Bible without giving much context, so bear with me as we jump into one brief section of one of the most theologically rich books of the Bible, Romans. In verses 13 and 14 of chapter 10, we read, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on Him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in Him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching?" There's much to be said from here, but a basic surface level truth is that preaching is important. Preaching the good news of salvation is the most important message this world needs, but similar to hearers needing a preacher, this generation needs a brain that can focus on the words of the preacher. Much of this is what Colin Hansen focuses on in his chapter of Scrolling Ourselves to Death, how the medium shapes the message for preachers. In talking about how preaching has changed, he discusses how the preacher's intellectual advantage has waned.
Yeah, so I don't know how distant people are in their experience from the classroom, especially if they're, remember, elementary school or something like that. And you realize that after the internet has fully taken hold, and I pretty much date that to the introduction of the smartphone, because the smartphone creates a certain level of ubiquity, that where the internet had been contained in certain portals, PCs, computers that you have to go to. Now you take it with you everywhere. There's no escaping it in there. But people used to see the computer as an extension of existing media. It was something that would make reading the news faster, or sending mail faster, or just make things a lot easier in there. But they didn't really have any conception that it would completely alter our relationship to knowledge, to have all information beyond anybody's wildest imagination available at your fingertips at any moment, but also with infinite amounts of potential misinformation. And now, of course, artificial intelligence, and really without much ability to check it against any norm, because those norms have gone by the wayside because of the internet. So I talked about how education used to be a lot about information. So you'd be sitting in rows in a classroom because you're getting information downloaded to you. So I'm using internet language back, but you're getting that transmitted to you from somebody who knows more, because he or she has read more books or had more experience than you. But that whole knowledge situation is totally different, because there's nothing that the person can teach you that is quicker or more efficient or nearly as exhaustive as what you could find at your fingertips, especially from YouTube or find from wherever else. And so you just have a basic flip where it's one thing if your pastor would often derive his authority because, well, he's studied more than you have. And have you read all the books that he's read, and have you gone and gotten the degrees that he has? Well, now whatever degrees he has and whatever books he's read pale in comparison to what is at least available to you. And why would you spend time going to a library or even sitting in front of a TV when you have nonstop podcasts that you can listen to in your headphones, from your pocket, while you're washing dishes, while you're doing laundry, something like that? So the whole information experience is completely flipped on its head. And so preaching is more distant now from the teaching experience, meaning it's not necessarily the case. I mean, it still is generally, because not everybody takes advantage. They don't avail themselves of all those resources. But it's not primarily now about, well, the pastor is an authority because he's studied a lot more and he has the degrees and he has the credentials to show that. Now it's more like, well, the pastor may have his interpretation of things, but I have infinite libraries of information that can check that against him. And also the internet has trained me that I shouldn't trust any external authorities, only what I have personally vetted through my my sense of self and my self-identity. And if information comes to me that doesn't conform to what I want to hear, then that's problematic. Again, because you expect to be in the control seat through your smartphone, whatever else. You don't expect that somebody else would be dictating anything to you. That's just not how most of us learn how to do things anymore. So if you don't like somebody on YouTube who's teaching you how to repair something, you just close that and you search for another one, and there's seemingly infinite options that you go to in there. You're not stuck with anybody in there. So that's kind of how we approach preaching as well. If we don't like what we're hearing there, we have the option, of course, of easily finding any other church, or more likely in many cases, just staying home and listening to whatever you want yourself.
Not only is there an intellectual challenge that now exists for the preacher, there's also an entertainment challenge.
Yeah, this stands out so much in ways that we probably take for granted. So part of what Postman was trying to say was that theologians such as Jonathan Edwards or Martin Luther, when they're preaching, their content is extremely dense. And Edwards also he really wasn't known for being a dynamic preacher, at least until he met George Whitefield, who was known for being perhaps one of the most dynamic preachers of all time. And then he changed some of his delivery and things like that. But one of the things that TV simply changed is that everybody is judged by the standards of the preachers who are effective in that medium because it reaches so far. So just like a presidential debate would be considered boring, i.e., not entertaining, which is the point of TV. TV is there to sell you soap. It's not there to edify you. It's not there to accomplish anything except to sell you soap or whatever you want to, insert there for your commercial in there. It's simply a commercial enterprise. There's no other point to it, which in and of itself is a certain dynamic. So Postman would say, well, you expect when you're on TV, the normative encounter is with the pitchman. So the kind of preachers that are going to thrive in a television era are going to be Joel Osteen or Norman Vincent Peale or Jimmy Swaggart or Baker, whatever. I mean, and Tammy Faye Baker, like those are the kinds of people. I mean, imagine it's not like no one was ever like this before. Again, I said George Whitefield. Other than the fact that he was probably cross-eyed, he probably would have been pretty effective in TV. Amy Semple McPherson, she definitely would have been effective in television. So it's not like it was just invented there, but we're all judged by how we kind of come across as telegenic. And so Billy Graham would be a really positive example of somebody who was exceptionally telegenic, and a lot of his spiritual gravitas was communicated through that medium, also through radio. He was effective in both, and he's one of the only preachers that you can still hear regularly on, say, like Sirius XM radio today, along with Joel Osteen. Not a coincidence there. But yeah, the medium's not neutral because you're not going to hear a Jonathan Edwards channel. Or you're not going to have a Martin Luther Classics, not only because there wasn't TV, but because even if you tried to dress it up and act it out, the greatest sermons of all time, Chrysostom or something like that, it just wouldn't communicate because the medium will shape or even go so far as to dictate the message that is communicated in there. So that's what Postman was trying to get at in the television era. And like I said, I think we probably just about take it for granted now because here's a whole leap forward of what we're trying to accomplish in scrolling ourselves to death. It's not that we've left behind the TV era and gone to the internet. It's that the internet has made everything a TV because now so many preachers are posting their messages on YouTube. And so when you're posting your messages on YouTube, you simply cannot afford to be thinking primarily of people who you're looking at, because those people are not the kind of people who will either make your message spread broadly, which is presumably the point of putting it on YouTube, nor are they the kind of people who are going to cause you a lot of trouble, meaning all the people who could watch you on YouTube and take something out of context or not understand something. So you could say, well, I'm just preaching to these people right here, but I'm just going to post that message online. We would argue, building on Postman, that is simply not how that works. If you're going to put your message on YouTube, then you are preaching to YouTube. That's the medium that you need to be concerned about because of its permanence, seemingly, its ubiquity, the way that anybody can watch it in any circumstance. That's very different from a captive audience of people who have a certain level of knowledge of who you are as a preacher. So the medium is not neutral. It's not just adding one thing. It's that when you add preaching to YouTube, you add just, put yourself on YouTube. Now that becomes the primary medium that will begin to dictate. And you better believe no preacher who's preaching to YouTube would say, oh, it's not a big deal that I looked that way. It was fine for in person. No, you're going to be dressing for YouTube, and there's going to be lighting for YouTube. It's going to change very much the experience.
No doubt some of you listening to this are preachers, or you have preached before in your life. But for those who aren't, try and consider how challenging it is to write one sermon. All the reading, writing, praying, meditating, and research, but you have to do that every week. There are other tasks the preacher has to deal with each week. All that to say, preaching is already challenging enough. This challenge has grown because of the advancement of technology. In light of this, I asked Colin what he's learning from other preachers. In his role at the Gospel Coalition, he interacts with preachers from all over the world. When they confide in him, what are the challenges that he hears?
Just had a pastor call me about this this afternoon before we recorded. The pastoral ministry is for very, very few people a way to become famous or a way to become rich. It's very hard to do it. The kinds of things that are the staple of pastoral ministry, preaching, Bible studies, weddings, funerals, they can make you really deeply significant in some people's lives, but they won't make you significant in most people's lives or many people's lives, including the kind of people who would, download your sermons and, watch your YouTube feed and things like that, who would then get you invited to go to conferences that people like me plan or get published books that people like me publish, all that kind of stuff. So what kind of hangs over every pastor now is, how much do I have to care about what's happening in internet world? Because pastors are disproportionately engaged in internet world, and it's a real world. It's not totally reflective of the physical world. They're different worlds, but there's some overlap, but not total. But generally speaking, pastors are far more aware of what's happening online than most people in their congregation. The problem is, a few people in their congregation are usually way more involved than they are online, and it almost never has a positive influence on them. I've said this as something, a rule of thumb for pastors to talk about. What does the time that these people in your church spending online, does it make them fall deeper in love with God's word and more loving toward their neighbors? If it does that, then God bless them. I hope that's what they get out of my podcast and the Gospel Coalition and things that we do. I hope that's what we're doing. But if it's not doing that, then it's something bad that you should discourage. It's not, more information is not necessarily a positive development for them. So pastors now have this sense of, they want to know what's happening online because they're information workers, and information workers are especially online, and they get a lot of help from things online. They learn a lot from online. But second, that's not necessarily what people in their congregation care about. But third, it's definitely what some of the people who typically end up as their biggest critics care about. So the tension is, how much should I pay attention, and how much should I expand my personal brand online? Not just reposting things, but should I be looking to build a big podcast? Should I be looking to build out my YouTube page with other content? So everybody now feels as though there's an infinite amount of work that could be done on top of the infinite amount of pastoral ministry that you already do. Because if the internet is your flock, well, of course, then there's no end to those needs. There's already no end to the needs, even if you only have 50 people in your church. But now, just imagine billions of people who've never even heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the burden of service is pretty overwhelming, and pastors don't know how much they should care about it, and certainly how much they can afford to care about that ministry online.
Statistics show that we, especially teenagers, spend most of our waking hours on screens without a lot of direction on managing our online life. In the devotional, Social Media Pressure, Finding Peace Alongside Jesus, it will help you see why social media can leave you feeling sad, anxious, and depressed, and points to practical ways of turning to Jesus for rest and wholeness. The 16-day devotional will guide you in making sure that your relationship with God remains at the center of your life without letting your phone take over. This devotional addresses common issues associated with social media, including pressures like the fear of missing out, comparing yourself with others, being bullied, and even being addicted. Each entry will help you interact with social media in a way that is sensible, smart, and even biblical, while at the same time finding the peace that comes with walking alongside Jesus. You can pick up your copy of this devotional today at Amazon or visit New Growth Press to get a discount rate for bulk orders of groups to work through this devotional together. More information in the show notes. As we're reflecting on the impact the internet and social media has on the preached word, and that's not simply just how people will hear it with declining attention spans or how much pressure the preachers have to work to capture the attention and entertain their audience to a degree, we come back to a truth we've mentioned. That truth is this: all technology comes with a cost. Not simply a monetary cost, but we often lose something with each new technology. This is a truth Postman clearly communicated. Colin and I discussed this in light of a TGC article discussing physical Bibles versus digital Bibles. And just to put a finer point on what Colin is about to share, he said that some of the angriest feedback they've ever received at the Gospel Coalition came over physical versus digital Bibles.
Yeah, that was a telltale moment. Still to this day, the angriest I've ever seen the readers about the Gospel Coalition. Well, that's the people angry about some things, but that was the angriest. Yeah, we published somebody saying that he still thinks that there are good reasons to be using a physical Bible versus an iPad. Okay. Now, here's one of the things that I teach in my class. People don't realize that the book is a technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's an artifact. It's technology. It's technology. Okay. Technological artifact. So there were scrolls before. There were parchments before. The codex, or what we know as the book, was an invention of binding things together. Okay. So I said, what is the experience of reading the Bible as a codex? I think this is under God's providence, so I think there's some purposes. I don't think that we should go back to reading the Bible as scrolls, okay? Let's imagine it as a codex. Well, it teaches you that it's one story, not 66 different stories, that there is a progression, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, okay? Well, that's a technological thing. Then, in terms of pedagogy, just how we learn things, you learn to understand, okay, where does it fit in the story? Where do I pinpoint it there? And then just in terms of how you remember it, where does it appear on a page? Okay. So you go back and most of us, when we've read a lot of books or even just a few books, you can remember, oh, it was on the left-hand side toward the top, or two columns, inward, inside column toward the bottom. That's one of the ways we just remember. Okay. Well, the iPad's a totally different experience, because you have no sense of progression because the screen never changes. So you scroll, but you don't go anywhere. So you're not flipping through. There's all sorts of differences there. It doesn't feel like one story. It feels like everything feels like a fraction there. Mm-hmm. Now, there are all sorts of different uses. You can quickly find stuff in there. You don't have to remember. You can remember a fragment. You can trace. Now you can do this in a codex as well, but very quick to chase references down. Anyway, all that to say, it's the Bible both places. The Holy Spirit works through both versions. And I wouldn't necessarily say one is better in every circumstance because both of them are better at different things. Overall, I would still prefer the physical Bible for a host of reasons, but it doesn't mean that I never bring my Logos app with me to church and quickly track down some Greek and Hebrew words. That's really helpful to be able to do. So it's not that there's no purpose for any of that, but it's simply to say that when you jump in and adopt a new technology and say, oh, imagine how much easier it's going to be for me to preach from an iPad than it would be from a physical Bible. It's that we tend to emphasize, as Americans and as Christians, as part of just who we are identity-wise, we tend to emphasize what a new technology brings, but we tend not to anticipate what it may take away. So we don't necessarily count the cost of it. So I'm not telling people put your head in the sand and never use a new media technology, because that would be the height of hypocrisy given my own work. Mm-hmm. But I would say you need to be thoughtful about where this is going and the positives and the negatives. Of course, there are so many different avenues we could go on here. But for example, right now I take a journaling Bible and I write notes in it because I'm planning to hand that to my oldest son. And then when I get done with that one, I'll do it again for my daughter. Then I'll do that for my younger son. Okay. Well, you could do that on an app, but it definitely would not have anything of the same feel. And it wouldn't have, now you could lose that Bible, physical Bible, but it's less likely you're going to lose that physical Bible than that some technology is going to get superseded, and thus you're going to lose those notes. So just meaning that there are certain elements of even transmission of the faith that are included here. By the way, we can extend this out more broadly because there's been a huge movement lately toward getting back to hymnals for a number of reasons. Some of them connected back to the historical continuity of the church and the message of the gospel in there. So, yeah, I just think in general, it's great to adopt new technologies because they often will bring new opportunities. But you have to weigh them with discernment against what they take away, and you have to learn to mitigate against that. And I haven't even mentioned the basic problem with the smartphone, which is that you have the infinite distractions because it handles everything else. So you could never get away with Scripture, get away with the Lord with your, you could turn off notifications and whatnot, but the temptations are, it's still, you can still do that, but you're really fighting an uphill battle.
What is the call for Christians who are seeking to use social media in kingdom-minded ways? How can Christians use it for good? This has been a question we wrestle with, and we need to wrestle with it, not only for our own sakes, for our children and students. Once again, this is something preachers wrestle with, but many of them are wrestling with it from their need to know what their congregation is seeing through YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok. Not only do some pastors feel a need to know what's quote unquote out there on social media, but there are those who feel that their job requires a social media presence. As Colin answers the question, what's your relationship with your smartphone? He gets into some of these tensions that other Christians feel.
I once heard somebody say that the sins that preachers talk about most often are their own sins. They won't say that, and it can get real uncomfortable when you start to apply that. You're like, man, my pastor talks a lot about XYZ. What does that mean? But at least we tend to talk about the ones that we're most familiar with. If I can't imagine myself ever being tempted by something, it's just a little bit hard. It just doesn't come across the same way when I talk about it. So I definitely think the reason we talk about smartphones so much at the Gospel Coalition is because our work is so closely tied to that. So I didn't mention this earlier, but Ivan and Brett were the two people that I had in charge of social media at TGC for a long time. And both of them can rarely, if ever, be found on social media anymore. That's not a coincidence. It's sometimes the people who've taken the deepest dive who want to get out the quickest. So it's a pretty constant battle for me because it's not only the case that for all of us, and this, I mean, I don't know what you see out there, but I definitely know a number of pastors with multiple phones, because you just can't get away from anything. It's just very hard to, I mean, how can you relax when members of your congregation, you can even be off for vacation, but first of all, people may not even know that you're off for vacation. So when they're texting you at 3 a.m. with a crisis or a question, it can be totally innocent on their part. They don't know that you're gone. They don't know that you're taking a break. They don't know that you're trying to work on sermon prep or that you needed a lot of rest to recover from something. They don't know that. But the accessibility is a total change. And so my job is very similar. I looked and on Sunday, I was reading a couple different articles that were hugely significant for the kind of work that I do. I remember thinking, I'm glad that I was paying attention, because if I'd missed these articles, I would have been, much less off, worse off for it. But I thought, well, it also means that there's not even a Sunday where I could even just get away from work and away from my phone. So I think for us who worked on this book, and including me, we talk about these subjects so often because we have the biggest problems or the biggest temptations with the issue.
It seems that one possible solution to the decreased attention spans is the need to remain embodied in the physical world. Embodiment is something that can take on many forms. So I asked Colin what he seeks to do to remain embodied.
Yes, there are a lot of different things that I do. And another thing that's maybe specifically different for me or difficult is that I don't work in the physical place. I don't have any physical work. Like I'm a remote with everything. So if you're a pastor, at least you have a place where you're rooted physically that you can go and do your work and do your ministry. But for me, that just doesn't exist. So I have to do a number of different things that just keep me embodied anywhere. Of course, church is one of them, church, small group, things like that. Related to that, then also for my personal devotions, I mentioned earlier that just using a physical journaling Bible and having that generational aspect to it, that definitely helps me a lot. Then something our family does just in terms of physical embodiment, like being in, it's kind of weird of saying that when you're reading scripture, you're trying to be in this world. But it's just sort of trying to get out of the mediated, the Bible is itself a mediated technology, but trying to get away from the digital mediation that brings so many of the other distractions in there. So trying to use a physical Bible there. And then with my kids, now we do change this up. I found that the stuff built off Kevin DeYoung's story Bible, the videos, by the way, are amazing. Mm-hmm. Amazing. So our family will watch those. So we do include that digital element in there. But otherwise, we're reading the books. We're singing out of the New City Catechism, the physical version in there, though sometimes we use the app to remind ourselves of the songs. And then we're using a physical hymnal to go back, and specifically one from my church tradition growing up, and that has a measure of continuity in there. So we kind of change things up of using those different things, but combine those the spiritual side, the ecclesial side with church, and then physically just being out in a gym, in a class with other people is really helpful to stay physically embodied, and also just walking, just walking around in my community are some of the things that I do there. But it's not easy, because that glow is pretty appealing.
Throughout this episode, Colin has brought up many things for us to ponder, and at times, some of this can seem so overwhelming. Where do we begin? What do we do? How can we make changes? Maybe your only action item for today is what he briefly shared. Go for a walk. You've been listening to Digital Christianity by Reformed Youth Ministries. For more information about our summer conferences, youth leader training, and resources, visit rym.org. If you would take the time to leave a positive review and share this podcast with others, it's one small way to help our ministry. Stay tuned to the RYM podcast for more great content that seeks to serve the church in her efforts to reach and equip youth for Christ.